My name is Nora Hayes, and I am 33 years old. At my own wedding reception, my mother handed me a velvet-wrapped box. When I opened it in front of 120 guests, it contained nothing but empty air. My mother smiled while I stared into that velvet void. She had orchestrated the entire moment. She wanted everyone in that room to witness it. But that empty box wasn't the cruelest thing that happened that night. And it wasn't the event that broke my family apart forever. What my grandmother slipped into my hands 20 minutes later did that. His snorts, and what my mother almost did when I opened that second box at the head table is something I will carry with me until my last breath. Welcome back to their secret stories, where we step into the quiet fractures that rebuild a family, the moments that unfold across kitchen tables and church halls, far from courtrooms. If stories about quiet dignity and standing your ground resonate with you, leave a comment and make sure to subscribe. Let me rewind, because a gift box doesn't end up empty by accident. I work as a senior contract paralegal at a firm 2 blocks from the district court. I analyze legal documents for a living. I notice when a single clause is missing, and I notice when a human being is quietly erased. In my family, I was always the dependable one. When my grandmother needed a ride to her cardiologist, I took time off to drive her. When someone had to stay overnight at the hospital, I was the one sitting in the hard plastic chair. When my sister Megan forgot our mother's birthday, I bought the crystal vase and signed both our names. I was praised for exactly one quality my entire life: being sensible. Never brilliant, never striking, never extraordinary, just sensible, the way a person praises a reliable used sedan. My mother, Victoria, calculated everything in dollars and social standing. I learned very early that affection in our household always came with a balance due. You earned your place at her table, paid for it in compliance, and the ledger was never marked settled. I became expert at paying. I brought meals to visitations for distant relatives I barely knew. I remembered every anniversary. I picked up the phone at 2 a.m, and I never once asked why my number was the only one they dialed. Somewhere along the way, I made myself a quiet promise, the kind you never speak aloud. I believed that if I just gave enough and executed every task flawlessly, one day it would finally be enough. I never dared finish the thought enough for what. I was afraid of the answer because I suspected the bottom of that vault was empty. I just didn't expect my mother to wrap that emptiness in satin and hand it to me in front of everyone I knew. Then I met Luke Vance, and for the first time in my life, no one was holding a tally sheet. Luke is a high-rig industrial welder. He repairs steel towers in freezing rain so power grids stay online, and his hands bear the marks of his trade, calloused, warm, and rock-steady. We met when a main transformer blew on my avenue, plunging half the district into darkness for 2 days. He was the electrician still working at 11 at night after the rest of the crew had packed up. I brought him a thermos of coffee because the temperature was dropping, and he thanked me as if I'd handed him gold. We stood in the dark talking for an hour. He asked me questions no one had asked me in years. Not what firm I worked for, but what made me lose track of time. Not what my title was worth, but what made me laugh. When I mentioned I was a paralegal, he didn't ask about my salary band. He asked if the work felt meaningful. On our third date, he repaired my elderly neighbor's sagging porch step and refused the $30 she tried to put in his coat pocket. That's just who he is. He sees something broken and fixes it. And he never hands you a bill. The first time he looked at me, truly looked at me, I felt something entirely unfamiliar. Then it clicked. He was looking at me as though I was already complete. Not complete if, not complete when, just complete as I stood. I had spent 3 years auditioning for a role in my own family, and this man in work boots had cast me in the lead on day 1. I fell in love with him before I allowed myself to admit it, and I immediately began to dread one specific moment, the night I would have to introduce him to my mother. The engagement dinner took place at a downtown steakhouse Victoria chose specifically because the menu prices weren't published online. There were 14 of us. My mother had designed a formal seating arrangement, which should have been my immediate red flag. She placed Luke at the far end of the long table, right beside the small side setup where Megan's 9-year-old daughter, Chloe, and 2 younger cousins were coloring on paper mats, the children's table. She did it with a warm smile, the way she executes every subtle cruelty, so that if you object, you look like the one creating a scene. Luke took his seat without a single word of complaint and immediately started showing little Chloe how to draw a bridge structure that could hold weight. Halfway through the 3rd course, my mother addressed him across the entire dining room, asking precisely what a man in his trade brings home in a year. She framed it sweetly. She referred to his work on structural steel like he was a casual handyman. My aunt chuckled. Megan laughed half a second later, the way she always echoes our mother, slightly louder and right on cue. Luke stated his income plainly, with zero hesitation or shame. My mother repeated the figure back slowly, emphasizing the number so everyone could hear how small she considered it. I opened my mouth to speak. Beneath the white tablecloth, a hand rested on my knee and squeezed gently. It wasn't Luke's. I turned my head. My grandmother, Clara, 84 years old, was quietly folding her cloth napkin and stepping away from the main table. She walked past the empty chair next to my mother and sat down in the spare seat beside Luke at the kids' table. She asked him about working on high steel during winter storms. She asked him if his hands ever went numb up there. The entire table fell dead silent. That was the first crack of light I had seen in 33 years, though I didn't yet understand why my grandmother, of all people, had taken his side so decisively. My mother has a subtle habit that reveals everything about her character. When she's displeased, she opens the calculator application on her smartphone and taps away, as if running an internal audit on a bad transaction. She did it in the car on the drive back, sitting in the passenger seat with her thumb moving rhythmically over the screen. Then she uttered the words I'd quietly feared since childhood. She called my upcoming marriage a poor investment. She said it with the cold detachment of a broker describing a failing stock. She reminded me that our family carried a respected name in this county, a reputation, and that I was squandering it on a man who works with an arc welder. Then she glanced at me sideways and added something I didn't fully grasp in that moment. She said that if I went through with the wedding, I shouldn't expect anything to remain waiting for me. "Your share," she called it. "Don't come asking about your share." I asked her what share she was talking about. She just kept tapping her screen. I assumed she meant her personal approval, which I'd never truly possessed anyway. I assumed she meant an inheritance figure I had never factored into my life. I didn't know yet that my share had a physical address, a timber frame, a clear view of the river, and a flight of oak stairs my grandfather had hand-planed 50 years ago. I didn't know my mother had already begun quiet negotiations to sell it, or that she needed me to remain compliant so she could complete the deal. I sat in the passenger seat while my mother calculated my net worth and deemed me bankrupt, and for one bitter second, a small, quiet girl inside me wondered if her arithmetic was right. There is a house I need to describe to you. My grandfather, Thomas, constructed it himself on a bluff overlooking the Blackwood River, raised beam by beam over the span of a decade. I don't know how an industrial working man found the hours, but I know that every safe memory from my childhood exists within those wooden walls. Grandpa taught me how to cast a line off the wooden dock he built. He showed me how the staircase trees were fitted together with double dovetail joints so they would never creak underfoot. And to this day, they remain completely silent. He passed away 6 years ago when I was 27. I still occasionally catch myself reaching for my phone to tell him about my week. My grandmother Clara still lives out there alone, 20 miles past the county line, and I make the drive almost every weekend because someone should, and because I want to be there. 2 weeks before the wedding, I dropped by my mother's house to return some tax forms. I heard her speaking on the phone from the back sunroom. She was using her polished business voice, the smooth, persuasive tone she uses when negotiating. She was speaking to a commercial real estate agent about the river property. She used the phrase, clearing the title. She used the word, outdated. She was arranging the sale of my grandfather's house, the single place on earth that still smelled of cedar, river breeze, and pipe tobacco. I stood in the entry hall with the documents in my hands, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. Then I remembered one critical fact, and I anchored myself to it. The house didn't belong to Victoria. The deed was registered entirely in my grandmother's name. It always had been. My mother could arrange sales all day long, but the signature belonged to Clara. What I failed to realize was how far my mother was willing to go to force her hand. 3 days later, my mother executed her next strategic move, and she put it in writing. She sent a mass email to our entire family network, aunts, uncles, cousins, relatives on my late father's side, everyone. In the message, she announced that she was officially withdrawing her offer to contribute to the wedding expenses. She had pledged to cover the venue and the catered dinner months prior in front of numerous witnesses, and now she was revoking it in the most public manner possible. She wrote that she refused to subsidize reckless decisions with poor long-term fundamentals. She actually used those words to describe her own daughter's wedding. Copy and 30 people on the thread as an open challenge. The implicit message was clear: cancel the wedding, yield to her authority, apologize for disrupting the family image, and perhaps the funding would be restored. That was the purpose of broadcasting it to 30 people. She wanted the social pressure to crush my resolve. Luke read the email over my shoulder at my kitchen counter. His jaw tightened, and he said just one thing: then we pay for our own wedding. And that's what we did. We relocated the ceremony to the fellowship hall of a small stone church on Highway 12. We sat down with our bank statements like rational adults and budgeted $14,000 of our personal savings. No crystal chandeliers, no plated four-course service, just sturdy wooden tables, warm string lights, and potluck dishes brought by people who actually cared about us. I cried at that kitchen counter, but not out of grief. For the very first time, the event belonged entirely to us. No one had purchased it, which meant no one could hold it over my head. I felt a knot in my chest uncoil, a tightness I hadn't even realized I'd carried my whole life. The week before the wedding, Megan accidentally let the secret slip. We were writing the place cards at my kitchen table when my sister, who can never keep a secret for long, smirked and mentioned that Mom had prepared a special presentation for the reception, something designed for maximum visibility. She framed it as a dramatic surprise. I asked her to elaborate, but she covered her mouth and claimed she'd sworn an oath, which meant she was desperate to brag about it. All she added was that Victoria wanted to make a definitive point in front of the entire family. A cold sensation settled in my stomach, the exact feeling I get when analyzing a contract clause designed to conceal an unfair liability. That evening, my mother called, ostensibly to confirm parking arrangements at the chapel. Near the end of the brief call, she dropped her voice into that light, melodic register she uses right before landing a blow. "Don't worry, Nora," she said softly. The reception will reveal to everyone precisely what this union is worth. She wished me a pleasant night, as if she'd just paid me a compliment. I hung up the phone knowing with absolute certainty that she had constructed a trap and tied it with a bow. Here is what people rarely understand about a situation like that: you cannot simply run away. It was my wedding day. You don't abandon your own celebration because your mother is preparing a stunt. You can't turn away 100 guests who traveled to be there. You can't cancel the venue at the 11th hour. And if you refuse a gift publicly before it's even opened, you become the villain in the narrative she created. So I made the only rational choice available to me. I resolved that whatever rested inside that box, I would not grant her the emotional breakdown she had paid to see. I had no idea that my grandmother had spent 60 years preparing a gift of her own. On the morning of the ceremony, the fellowship hall on Highway 12 smelled of fresh pine, rain, coffee, and floor wax. Luke arrived long before the florist, the caterer, or me. When I stepped inside, he was balanced high on a wooden ladder in his work shirt, hanging strands of warm Edison bulbs himself, because he didn't like how loosely the rental crew had secured them. Of course he was. The man builds things to last. He had wired the circuit himself so every bulb glowed evenly, and when he threw the switch, flooding the hall with a soft, amber light, little Chloe clapped her hands. Chloe had appointed herself my personal assistant for the morning. She followed me around the dressing room, holding the train of my dress off the floorboards, taking her responsibility with immense seriousness. She asked me if it was true that I was marrying a man who could fix anything that broke. I told her it was the absolute truth. My phone chimed while I was fastening the back of my gown in the chapel office. It was my grandmother. Her tone was measured and firm. She stated that she was attending the service regardless of what arrangements my mother had altered regarding her transportation, and that she would secure her own ride. Then she said something that made my fingers freeze on the fabric. Tonight, when the moment comes, I want you to stay right next to me. Whatever unfolds, stay close and wait. Can you do that for your grandmother? I agreed immediately without knowing what I was committing to. I asked her what was going to happen. She simply replied, "You will see, and Nora, do not open a single thing until I tell you to." She ended the call, leaving me standing in a half-fastened gown with my heart pounding, because my grandmother had never once sounded like a woman executing a covert plan. The ceremony itself was 20 minutes of pure clarity, right up until the moment I looked toward the front row. We kept it simple, no elaborate musical solos, no artificial theatrics, just Luke, myself, and a local pastor who had known Luke's family for years. Luke had written his vows on a piece of paper, so worn from being folded and unfolded that the edges were soft. He didn't promise fairy tales or effortless days. He promised to keep our home standing through every storm. He promised that when the winter weather took the light from the sky, I would never have to search for him in the cold. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Mine did too. Chloe held the edge of my veil. The small hall was filled with people who had brought homemade dishes, extra folding chairs, and genuine warmth. And in the front row sat my mother, wearing a designer suit that cost more than our entire food budget, her hands clasped in her lap, her right thumb tapping an invisible rhythm against her knuckles. Even now, she was running calculations, adding up what this modest hall was costing her in public standing. She didn't shed a tear. She didn't offer a real smile, she audited. Then, midway through the exchange of rings, the double doors at the rear of the hall swung open, and an elderly neighbor quietly wheeled my grandmother inside. My mother had deliberately declined to organize transport for Clara. I learned later that Victoria had informed the rest of the family that Grandma was far too frail to attend and shouldn't be exhausted by the trip. Yet there she sat in her dark blue dress, pushed down the side aisle by a neighbor she had called herself. Resting in her lap was a modest box wrapped in plain brown paper and bound with heavy twine. She held it with both hands as if it were the anchor keeping her grounded. My mother turned her head and saw her mother. For a fraction of a second, an expression crossed Victoria's face that I had never seen before. It looked distinctly like fear. At the reception, the atmosphere was divided, two groups mixing like oil and water. Luke's family was energetic and warm, embracing guests, filling plates, laughing freely. My mother's side sat straight, backed, spoke in hushed tones, and cast frequent, critical glances toward Luke, as if assessing a flaw in a display. I heard the word quaint, used to describe our setup 3 separate times, and every time it was delivered with condescension. I heard a cousin whisper that it was a pity a woman with my legal background was settling. I kept my posture straight, held Luke's hand tightly, and greeted every guest. All the while my mother sat at the central table like an overseer waiting for the scheduled hour. Next to her plate rested that pristine package, not a brown paper parcel like Clara's, but a glossy white box wrapped with a silver silk ribbon. Expensive, immaculate, exactly the sort of box you would expect to contain something extraordinary. My grandmother had asked me to position her wheelchair directly beside the head table, right between Luke and me. I did, and she kept one firm hand resting on my forearm the entire evening, exactly as she had instructed. When the main plates were cleared, my mother stood up and tapped her crystal glass with her ring. The room went quiet in the prompt, obedient way it always did for her. Before the music starts, she announced in her smooth, elevated public voice, "I would like to present my daughter and her new husband with a special gift, a tradition representing our family's standards." There was no such family tradition. I had lived in this family for 33 years and knew every habit. My grandmother's fingers tightened securely on my arm. Beneath the table, Luke reached over and took my other hand. My mother picked up that glossy white box and held it out toward me, smiling radiantly in front of every person gathered in the hall. I want you to picture the scene, 120 faces turned toward us. Warm Edison bulbs hanging overhead, my grandmother's grip firm on my arm, my husband's fingers locked in mine, my mother radiant and composed, presenting a gift I already knew was designed as a public execution, and me with no polite exit except to accept it. So I reached out and took it. It was light, far too light. A box of those dimensions, wrapped in heavy stock, should have carried tangible weight. This carried none. I knew before my fingers untied the silver ribbon precisely what I would find. I lifted the lid anyway, because 120 people were watching, and my mother had staked everything on breaking my composure. Inside lay absolute emptiness, white tissue paper neatly arranged around vacant space, no card, no token, no key, just the hollow interior of an empty box staring back at me, and into the heavy silence loud enough to reach the back corners of the hall. My mother spoke the sentence she had been refining for weeks. "That is precisely what this marriage is worth." A wave of laughter rippled through parts of the room. Not from everyone, but from enough. My aunt laughed, my cousins joined in, and Megan offered her customary half-second delayed laugh. The sound cutting through the air felt cold and sharp. My mother stood there glowing, waiting for me to shatter, because my public distress was the intended finale. The humiliation was the entire point. I looked down into that empty white space, and a truth I had spent my life ignoring suddenly became blindingly clear. She hadn't handed me nothing. She had handed me a mirror. This was how she had viewed me all along: sensible, functional, and ultimately devoid of intrinsic value. The only person in that entire room who wasn't laughing or smirking was 9-year-old Chloe, who was staring at her grandmother with her mouth slightly open in utter disbelief. Beside me, my grandmother's grip shifted from a rest to a firm hold, and she leaned into my shoulder. Clara pulled me down gently toward her, the way she used to when I was little, and she had something crucial to share. Her mouth was right beside my ear. Around us, the polite laughter was tapering off, and my mother remained standing, waiting for the tears she felt she had earned. I didn't give them to her. I bent closer to my grandmother instead. Beneath the drop of the tablecloth, hidden from the room, she pressed her brown paper parcel into my hands. It was warm from resting in her lap and noticeably heavy. "Do not open it here," she whispered, her voice steady and unyielding. "Carry it back to your chair at the head table where you belong. Open it there, slowly, Nora." She waited until I turned to look her directly in the eye. Her eyes were bright, fierce, and entirely resolute. "When you open it, you look directly at your mother," Clara commanded softly. "You do not break eye contact. Do you understand me, Nora?" "You look right at Victoria." I nodded, unable to form words. My hands closed around the rough paper, feeling the distinct contours inside something small, heavy, and metallic, alongside a folded piece of cardstock. My mother finally took her seat, satisfied that the show was concluded and that she had claimed total victory over the evening. She had no idea the real presentation hadn't even begun. I sat up straight. I set the empty white box aside on the floor without a single word of acknowledgement, an omission that visibly thrown my mother off, because a dramatic reaction was the fuel her performance required. I placed my grandmother's parcel on the table in front of me beneath the amber light bulbs Luke had installed. I untied the heavy twine. The brown paper folded back silently. Inside was a hand-carved walnut chest my grandfather had built. I recognized his craft immediately. The precision of the joinery, the smooth oil finish. Inside that wooden chest, resting on a swatch of faded blue velvet, were 3 items. The first was a woman's wedding ring, a thin band of gold worn down almost to a wire on the inner edge, the way metal wears when it stays on a working hand for 60 years without being removed. My grandmother's ring. The second item was a heavy brass emblem, slightly tarnished around the edges, stamped with the official insignia of the International Brotherhood of Boilermakers and Structural Iron Workers, complete with a registration number stamped beneath it. The third was a card folded into quarters. When I opened it, I recognized my grandmother's distinct cursive handwriting, the disciplined script she learned in a rural schoolhouse decades ago. The note was brief. "Everything this family owns was built by these hands." They called him a common worker. He was the wealthiest man I ever knew. "Wear the ring when you forget your value. Keep the pin near you when they attempt to price you. I have never forgotten where our foundation rests." They claimed he was worth nothing. "He built the very ground you stand on." I read the words twice. Then I executed my grandmother's exact instruction. I raised my head and looked directly across the space at my mother. Victoria, who had been smiling, accepting subtle nods for her little demonstration, saw the wooden chest open before me. She saw the brass Union emblem catch the overhead light. The color drained from her face instantly, as if a plug had been pulled. She half rose from her chair, her hand instinctively gripping the table edge. For a split second, I thought she was going to cross the floor and grab the box out of my hands. She caught herself sinking back into her seat. But everyone at our end of the room witnessed the shift. My mother was terrified, and in that moment, I finally understood that the empty white box had never been the true story in that room. I sat there holding that heavy Union pin, and 33 years of disjointed memories reordered themselves in my mind all at once. My entire life, my mother had spun a specific narrative about our lineage, an old family, distinguished heritage, people of elevated social standing, as if class were an inherited trait like eye color. but no one ever explicitly detailed what my grandfather had done for a living. His actual trade was never mentioned in her house. When I was a little girl, a framed photograph had hung in the back hallway, a stocky man in heavy work canvas, sleeve rolled up, smiling beside a massive structural beam. One day, the photo vanished. When I asked about it at 8 years old, my mother simply stated it was the wrong picture for that wall. I didn't press the matter. Now, holding that union seal in my palm, green with age, worn smooth by a thumb that must have rubbed it 1,000 times during long shifts, I realized that the man in the missing photograph and the man who built the silent staircase were the same person. My mother had spent my entire life systematically erasing his legacy, all that social standing she boasted about, the prestige she was willing to sacrifice her relationship with her daughter to maintain. It had all been funded by a structural boilermaker, by precisely the kind of working man she had just seated at the children's table, by precisely the kind of man she had just told 100 guests my marriage was worthless for choosing. I looked up from the chest and across the room. My mother was already moving. She had stood up, adjusted her jacket, restored her artificial smile, and was marching straight toward the head table with the brisk, urgent stride of a woman arriving to clean up a spill before it permanent stains the floor. She reached my chair with her party smile locked in place, her eyes as cold as glass. She leaned down and whispered that we needed to step outside into the vestibule for a moment. To any observer, it looked like a mother leaning in to share a warm word with the bride. I stepped out with her because I didn't want a scene in front of little Chloe, and because I wanted to hear what she would say when her audience was gone. The moment we reached the hallway near the coat racks, the warm smile vanished. "Close that box and put it away immediately," she commanded in a low, sharp voice. "This is entirely inappropriate for this event." I looked at her calmly and asked what she was so afraid of. My mother's own sentence echoed in my mind. "That is precisely what your marriage is worth." But for the first time, her authority sounded hollow. She ignored my question. Instead, she pivoted seamlessly to financial control and duty, her default strategy. "Your grandmother is losing her clarity," Victoria stated rapidly. "She is unwell. She gets confused by the past. That river house is falling into disrepair, and it needs to be liquidated before she does something foolish with it." She spoke quickly, persuasively, but my paralegal training picked up the structure beneath her words. The underlying motive was exposed. My mother didn't just want the house sold. She needed Clara to sign over the property rights to her, and she needed it done immediately, before anyone questioned whether Clara was acting under pressure. And she needed me quiet, compliant, and put back in my place so I wouldn't intervene. I stood in that hallway, looking at my mother, and the fear I had carried of her my entire life simply evaporated. It was a remarkable feeling, like dropping a heavy burden I had carried so long I'd forgotten I was holding it. Let me pause the narrative for a moment, because some of you listening right now might be sitting in the exact place I was sitting that night. If your personal value has ever been calculated by someone holding a checkbook or leveraging family status, hear me clearly, you are not the poor one in that equation. Take a moment right now to leave a comment with the city or country you're listening from tonight, and stay with me, because what happened the morning after the wedding changed everything. Back in the main hall, I returned to my husband, took his hand, and danced. I refused to let my mother claim another second of our night. But my mind was operating with legal precision, analyzing the structure of her scheme, identifying the pressure points and the solution. I read contracts for a living. I know what it looks like when an individual attempts to transfer real estate quietly and quickly. The abrupt revocation of wedding funds, the public humiliation, the sudden urgency regarding Clara's mental state, It all pointed toward a single objective. My mother was laying the groundwork to obtain that deed before anyone stepped in to stop her. The empty box was part of the psychological setup, a tactic to make me feel small, powerless, and irrelevant. She had made one fatal error. My grandmother had just handed me the key to stop her. That night, after the final guests had departed and Luke was stacking the folding chairs, I made a firm decision while sitting at the head table with the wooden chest open before me. Not a plan for revenge, but a decision to establish the truth. I decided that at first light, before we packed for any trip, before I even changed out of my bridal clothes, I was going to drive out to the river house, sit down with my grandmother, and ask her one direct question: "What do you want?" The morning after the wedding, Luke and I drove the 20 miles out to the river bluff with 2 hot coffees and no certainty about what we would find. My grandmother was sitting on the front porch when our truck pulled into the driveway, dressed alert and waiting as if she had anticipated our arrival. She was entirely sharp, let me state that clearly, because my mother had repeated the phrase, losing her clarity. So many times I had almost braced myself to find an infirm woman struggling in her own home. And snorts instead, I found Clara Hayes solving a newspaper crossword puzzle in ink. She poured us coffee in heavy ceramic mugs my grandfather had bought decades ago. She motioned for Luke to sit in Thomas's favorite wooden chair, looked at him thoughtfully for a long moment, and noted that he had honest, working hands. I watched my husband's neck go red with quiet pride. Then she turned to me and told me to sit down. Because there were historical truths I should have been told years ago, and she was done permitting my mother to control the narrative. She started at the beginning. She told us she had married Thomas in 1961 against her own family's fierce opposition, because they considered an apprentice boilermaker beneath a girl from their social bracket. She recounted how her mother had wept at the ceremony, not out of joy, but out of disappointment. She said her relatives had gifted them a set of basic, everyday diner plates as a wedding present, the cheapest kind available, to make a petty point about the working class life they assumed she was condemned to. Clara smiled warmly as she recalled it. "For 60 years I ate 3 meals a day off those plain plates," she said, "and every single meal tasted better than anything served on their fine bone china." Oh, she reached across the wooden table and placed her worn hand over mine, the hand now wearing her original gold band. "You married a good, honest man, Nora," she said. "I know precisely what your mother tried to do to you on Friday night. I experienced that exact same arrogance in 1961. Now let me tell you what she has been trying to hide." Here was the truth my mother had spent 30 years covering up. See, there was no ancestral wealth. There was no deep family estate. The status my mother paraded, the family name she guarded so fiercely, all of it had been created by Thomas Hayes's physical labor. He had started as a junior boilermaker at 19. He worked in sub-zero structural sites and inside scorching industrial boilers. He saved every dollar and eventually launched his own mechanical contracting firm with a single service truck and his name painted on the side door. The business grew. By the time my mother reached high school, Thomas employed 40 skilled tradesmen and operated a respected commercial enterprise, the kind of business that put my mother through a private university without a single student loan. He paid for every comfort of the lifestyle my mother now claimed as an inherent birthright, and my mother, Victoria, grew up as the boilermaker's daughter in a small town where snobbish peers never let her forget it. Children at her school taunted her, calling her father the grease monkey contractor. She despised it. She hated the work trucks parked in the driveway, the canvas overalls in the laundry room, the dark machine oil that took hours to scrub from her father's fingers. So the moment she gained independence, she systematically remade her identity. She married a man with an office title and a soft family name. She moved to an affluent neighborhood, and she buried her working-class father beneath a manufactured story of old money heritage so completely that her own children never learned the truth. My grandmother stated it without anger, simply laying out the facts. Your mother is deeply ashamed of the man who built every opportunity she ever enjoyed. I sat at that table holding the brass union emblem, the stature my mother used to look down on everyone, the social standing that made my marriage a poor investment. It had all been constructed by an industrial boilermaker, by the exact type of man she had relegated to the children's table, and she knew it. That was why she had turned pale at the sight of the pin. My grandmother stood up, moving slower than in her younger years, and returned with a battered cardboard shoebox filled with black and white photographs my mother assumed had been destroyed long ago. She spread them across the kitchen table, and I want to be fair to my mother here, because my grandmother was fair to her. In one photograph, my mother is about 12 years old, standing near the edge of a school gymnasium during a dance, wearing a handmade dress. You could read the expression on her face, even in the old print, intense embarrassment, holding her arms tightly against her sides, desperately wanting to disappear. Clara touched the edge of that photo, her voice softening. She explained that the other girls had shown up in expensive department store dresses and had made subtle, cruel remarks to Victoria all evening. She told us how Thomas had learned about it and how he had taken on massive overtime shifts for 2 straight months, working on his knees inside industrial heat exchangers, just so he could buy his daughter a designer gown from the premier boutique downtown. My mother wore that dress once. Then she stopped attending school dances altogether. Something inside her 12-year-old self decided she would never allow herself to be looked down on again, that she would elevate her status so high no one could ever patronize her. And she climbed right over her own father's legacy to accomplish it. I looked at that insecure 12-year-old girl in the photograph, and I felt a sudden, unexpected emotion for the woman who had handed me an empty box. I felt sympathy for her. My grandmother observed my reaction, then offered the insight that prevented my sympathy from turning into weakness. Understanding her pain explains her behavior, Nora, Clara said firmly. It does not justify her attempting to steal this house from under my feet, and it certainly does not give her the authority to dictate your worth. Understanding someone and submitting to them are 2 entirely different things. My grandmother then retrieved a legal folder from the sideboard and handed it to me. My paralegal training immediately took over as I scanned the documents. Inside was a pre-drafted quitclaim deed. It was fully prepared, transferring ownership of the river property directly from Clara Hayes to Victoria Hayes. All it required was Clara's signature. My mother had brought the document out the previous week, Clara explained, accompanied by persistent comments about how demanding the house was to maintain, how Clara might suffer a fall out there alone, and how much simpler it would be if Victoria assumed full management. She had left the deed on the table like an unpaid bill, informing my grandmother that a mobile notary public would arrive on Monday afternoon to formalize the transfer. Just 2 days away. I asked my grandmother directly and gently if she secretly desired to sign it, if perhaps maintaining the property was becoming too burdensome. She looked at me as if I'd asked whether she wanted to sever her own hands. "This is the home Thomas built for our family," she said quietly. "I raised you in these rooms. I am not confused, and I am not ready to surrender my independence. Victoria wants to sell this land so she can destroy the final physical place that bears his imprint, and I have been too passive and soft-spoken to stop her." Her chin trembled briefly, then set into firm resolve. "I refuse to let her have it, Nora. But I don't want this home to become a battleground either. I am done watching this family assign financial metrics to human relationships. I simply want this place protected. Forever. I sat there knowing a notary was scheduled for Monday, holding my grandmother's trust in my hands. I realized that my specific skill, that quiet, meticulous legal work that no one in my family had ever valued, was the precise tool needed to resolve this. So I asked Clara the fundamental question I had come to ask. What do you want to happen to this land? She pondered the question for a long moment, tracing the wood grain of the table, and when she answered, her instructions were crystal clear. She did not want to transfer the property directly to me. She stated that up front, looking me in the eye. If I deed it directly to you, Nora, your mother will claim I was manipulated or incompetent, and you will spend years legal fighting her in court. Clara explained. And worse, this house would become another asset people calculate. I am finished with calculation. I want this home removed from the market permanently. I want it placed into a binding trust that no individual can dissolve or sell, so I can reside here for the remainder of my life, and after I am gone, it remains a sanctuary for any member of this family who chooses genuine affection over social climbing. I want Thomas's real name on the deed, the boilermaker's name, the union man's name. She touched the brass emblem resting near her coffee cup. They claimed his life was worth nothing, she repeated softly. Let this stone and timber stand here for a century and prove otherwise. I told her I could draft the appropriate trust structure, working alongside a trusted real estate attorney from the courthouse circuit, and that we would include a formal medical evaluation to document her total mental competency, ensuring no legal challenge could ever succeed. Clara reached across the table and squeezed my hand tightly. Then let's beat Monday, she said. And for the first time during that heavy weekend, I laughed. That evening, my mother called my cell phone. Her tone was completely transformed, soft, almost affectionate, filled with a warm warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in years. And God help me, a quiet, hungry part of me that had been starved for her approval sat up instantly. She suggested that we had both acted out of stress. She admitted that perhaps the velvet box presentation was a bit dramatic, which was as close to a formal apology as Victoria Hayes was capable of delivering. Then she laid out her proposition smoothly. If I allowed the property transfer to proceed without interference, meaning letting her sell the river house, and if I kept all the outdated union history to myself without upsetting the extended family with stories about Thomas, she would reinstate me in her estate plan. She offered to fund an international honeymoon. She promised she would welcome Luke and me back into the family fold properly. She told me she was proud of how sensible I could be. Do you see what she was dangling before me? Everything I had spent my life craving. The precise acceptance I had been auditioning for since I was 5 years old. My mother's warmth. My restored place in the family hierarchy. My name written back into the ledger. All I had to do was remain quiet, permit her to sell my grandfather's home, and continue the fiction that he was a nobody. I told my mother I needed time to consider her offer. Of course, sweetheart, she replied gently. Take all the time you need. The word sweetheart landed like a barbed hook. I hung up the phone and sat down on the cold kitchen floor. Because the single thing I had spent my life pursuing, and the single action I could never live with, had just turned out to be the exact same transaction. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn with my grandmother's thin gold ring on my finger and the brass union pin resting on the wood before me. I ran the hardest balance sheet of my life, not with a calculator app, but in my conscience. Here is what became clear to me around 3 a.m. The empty box hadn't wounded me simply because it was hostile. I could manage hostility. It wounded me because a part of my own mind still accepted her framework, that my worth was strictly tied to my utility. That affection was something earned through performance, and that if I ever stopped complying, I was just empty space. I had been playing on her scoreboard my entire life, and her phone offer, the estate share, the honeymoon, the fake affection, was just her handing me the same scoreboard and asking me to keep playing. If I accepted, I would win her game and forfeit my own soul. Luke found me at the table as the morning light hit the windows. He didn't offer hollow advice. He simply sat beside me, placed his calloused hand over mine, and waited. I knew then that I was going to help my grandmother secure that property beyond anyone's reach on Friday morning, long before Victoria's Monday notary ever stepped foot on the porch. And then I was going to deliver my final answer to my mother. Not over the phone, not in a quiet whisper, but at the Sunday family brunch in front of the exact same people who had watched me open an empty box. Not out of vengeance. I was finished playing on her board, but to finally stop paying a debt that was never real. On Friday morning, I took a personal day, dressed in my professional suit, and drove my grandmother to the legal offices of Helen Montgomery, a razor-sharp property attorney I knew from court who leaves zero technical loopholes. I want to emphasize how straightforward the process was. There was no theatrical drama, no sudden legal trick. It was executed through careful, boring, precise legal procedure. The exact kind of careful work I do every day, the work no one in my family had ever celebrated. Grandmother met with Helen entirely alone first, ensuring no relative could ever claim undue influence was exerted. A physician who had treated Clara for 15 years conducted a formal evaluation that same morning, certifying in writing that Clara Hayes was of sound mind, fully articulate, and acting under her own uncoerced free will. Then, of her own volition, Clara transferred the river property into an irrevocable family land trust. She retained full lifetime occupancy rights. Upon her passing, the property would remain a protected family sanctuary that could never be mortgaged, subdivided, or sold. And on the first page of the deed, written in clear black ink, the trust was designated by its official title, the Thomas Hayes Sanctuary. When Clara signed her name, her hand was rock steady. Mine was shaking as I witnessed it. Helen notarized the documents, filed them with the county clerk, and the transfer became absolute, legal, and permanent 2 days before my mother's notary was scheduled to arrive. On the drive back, Clara rolled down the truck window and let the river breeze untidy her hair like a young girl, 60 years. She murmured, watching the water catch the light through the trees. Thomas would be so proud to know no developer will ever touch this land. Then she turned to look at me. You accomplished this using the exact trait they never valued in you, Nora. Your quiet, careful attention to detail. Look what it saved. I had never viewed my profession or my nature through that lens. I have thought about her words every single day since. The Sunday family brunch took place at my mother's home, served on her fine china. Victoria approaches hosting with the same calculated strategy as a political event. The long dining table, curated floral arrangements, linen napkins folded with geometric precision. She had, I realized the moment I entered, orchestrated a specific scene for the morning. She fully anticipated that I was coming to surrender. She had informed the family that I was returning to apologize. I could see it in the way she had arranged the seating, in the forced warmth she offered Luke, in the open chair she had reserved directly at her right hand. The seat of honor, the place I had spent 30 years trying to earn. She assumed this was the morning her sensible daughter yielded to reality, and she had built a stage to graciously receive my submission in front of the extended family. Megan was present alongside my aunts, cousins, and little Chloe, who had barely spoken to her grandmother since the reception. Chloe immediately walked over and sat in the chair right next to me, leaning against my arm the way I used to lean against Clara. I placed my grandfather's carved walnut box directly on the tablecloth beside my plate, not hidden, but resting clearly under the dining room chandelier. My mother noticed it, and her smooth expression faltered for a microsecond before she recovered, tapped her glass with her ring, and stood up to address the room. I let her speak. I let her navigate through her warm, patronizing introduction. "We are so pleased Nora has regained her perspective." The subtle references to family unity, the reaching out toward my hand. I let her construct her entire narrative. Then I stood up on my own 2 feet at my mother's table and said, "Thank you, Victoria." My mother beamed, believing that "thank you" was the opening line of the apology script she had drafted for me. She actually picked up her glass to lead a toast, assuming the matter was settled. She formally announced to the entire table that she and I had resolved our misunderstandings, that I was restored to the family estate plan, and that she would be assisting Luke and me in securing a proper home. She delivered it with royal condescension, looking around the room to collect the approving nods of her audience, and she received them. My aunts nodded, Megan exhaled with visible relief, and the room prepared to watch me take the golden seat and let the entire week of hostility be swept under the rug like it never happened. I could feel the immense, magnetic pull of it in my own chest just say yes, take the seat, accept the approval you bled for, end the conflict. I stood there in the full weight of that pressure, feeling my grandmother's thin gold ring against my finger, feeling little Chloe's shoulder resting against my arm, and meeting Luke's steady, unyielding gaze across the table. And I saw the transaction for what it truly was. She was offering me external approval in exchange for the one thing I had finally realized was priceless: my self-respect. My mother held her crystal glass aloft, glowing, confident, waiting for me to join her toast. I did not lift my glass. I stood there as calm and steady as deep water, in a manner that cost me more internal strength than any explosive outburst ever could. "Victoria," I said clearly, "I need to say something to everyone here, and I need you to hear every word before you raise that glass." I kept my voice entirely level. Everything I understood about my mother told me that the most powerful thing I could do in that room was state the plain facts, without anger or embarrassment. My mother didn't fear conflict. She feared the unvarnished truth exposed without shame. So I spoke the truth plainly. I opened the walnut chest, lifted out the delicate gold wedding band, and informed the room that it had belonged to Clara, worn through 60 years of continuous labor. Then I took out the heavy brass emblem and pinned it directly to the lapel of my jacket, where everyone could see it. I told them who had earned it. I spoke about Thomas Hayes, not as an attack, but as an introduction, because most of the younger relatives at that table had been fed a completely fabricated family history. I told them he was a master boilermaker, a proud union man who built his contracting business with his own physical strength, and that every single asset enjoyed in that room, this modern house, the fine china, the university educations, the social position, had been earned by a man who woke up at 4 a.m. and returned home with machine oil under his fingernails. I spoke my grandfather's full name aloud at my mother's dining table, the name she had spent 3 decades erasing, and I watched her turn completely pale. Then I delivered the rest of the facts, quietly and without a single note of hostility. I informed the family that Clara had chosen, working with her independent attorney and her physician, to place the River House into a permanent trust bearing Thomas's name, ensuring it could never be sold or liquidated by anyone. It would remain a permanent refuge for any member of this family who valued genuine connection over status. And I told them I had assisted her in completing the legal paperwork on Friday. My mother rose halfway out of her chair, her hands slammed flat against the linen tablecloth, her mouth open in absolute shock. For a moment, her entire polished facade shattered, exposing the anger, the deep-seated shame, and the insecure 12-year-old girl in the handmade dress all at once. Her snorts then, into the heavy silence of that room. I delivered my final response to her phone offer. "Thank you for the proposition regarding the estate plan and the honeymoon, Victoria," I said smoothly. "But I will not stay silent about where this family came from, and I will not assist you in liquidating my grandfather's legacy. So I fully expect you to withdraw your offer, and that is entirely fine." My mother's expression hardened into ice. The warmth vanished instantly from her eyes. She delivered the sentence she believed would destroy my resolve. She stated that if that was my final decision, I was permanently removed from her will, cut out entirely, and that I would never receive a single dollar from her estate. She spoke with absolute finality, waiting for me to break. She had handed me an empty box at my wedding and watched me refuse to cry, and she desperately needed to see her financial authority land a blow. And then the moment occurred. The moment I had not rehearsed, but will hold dear for the rest of my life. I looked at my mother, then I looked at Luke, whose steady presence had never wavered, at my grandmother's ring on my finger, and at little Chloe, who was watching me the way I had once watched Clara, learning in real time that a person is allowed to stand tall. I looked Victoria directly in the eyes and said the simplest, truest words of my life. "You can keep the money. My worth was never yours to calculate." The room was so quiet you could hear the mantel clock ticking in the hall. My mother had spent 33 years holding the pen that wrote my valuation, and I had just calmly taken it out of her hand and set it down forever. I walked away from the inheritance in that second. I walked away from the golden seat at her table. I surrendered the faint hope of maternal approval I had chased since childhood. I felt every bit of that illusion dissolve, and beneath the loss, as solid and dependable as Luke's hand, I felt myself become entirely free. I didn't storm out or make a dramatic exit. There was nothing left to prove. I told my mother I loved her, which was true, and which proved far more unsettling to her than anger would have been. Then I picked up the wooden chest. Luke gathered our coats, and we walked toward the front door. Little Chloe caught up to me in the entryway. She reached out, touched the brass union emblem on my jacket, and asked in her clear 9-year-old voice, "Aunt Nora, what does this pin mean?" I knelt down so we were at eye level. I told her it belonged to her great-grandfather Thomas, that he was a master craftsman who built structures and fixed heavy machinery, that he was one of the finest men who ever lived, and that if anyone ever tried to tell her working with your hands was something to hide, they didn't understand what a human being was worth. She nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the lesson, and asked if she could visit the river house one day. I told her the house would always be there, that it could never be sold now, and that it belonged to her and her children for the rest of their lives. Behind me, I heard my mother sink slowly into her chair at the head of her long dining table, and Megan, my sister who had spent her entire life echoing our mother's cold laugh half a second late, did not laugh. She stood in the archway of the dining room holding her napkin, looking at me, then at the brass emblem, then at her own daughter. An expression crossed her face I had never seen there before, genuine, unscripted doubt. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. I drove home beside my husband, wearing my grandmother's gold band and my grandfather's union pin, financially poorer by every metric my mother tracked, but richer than I had ever been in my entire life by the only metric that actually mattered. It has been 6 months now. I will give you the complete truth, because this isn't a fairy tale and you deserve an honest conclusion. My mother did formally remove me from her legal estate, and she has held to that decision. We rarely interact. She continues to tell acquaintances about our family's elevated social status, continues to host her formal brunches, and still opens her calculator app whenever she feels insecure. The core injury inside her was never healed, and an old wound like that doesn't disappear just because her daughter developed a backbone. I didn't fix my mother. You cannot fix someone who is attached to their own pretense. But the house on the Blackwood River remains standing, and it will continue to stand with Thomas Hayes's name registered on the deed where anyone can see it. My grandmother Clara still resides there comfortably. Every Saturday, Luke and I drive the 20 miles out to the property. He repairs whatever structural fittings need attention, and I complete the newspaper crossword puzzle with my grandmother in ink. We hung the black and white photograph back up in the main hallway, the picture my mother had hidden away so long ago. The stocky man in heavy canvas, smiling proudly beside his steel beam. Megan has started calling me occasionally, cautiously like someone testing thin ice, but she calls. And Chloe asked her mother last month why no one ever shared stories about the great grandfather who could build anything from scratch. I learned that Megan didn't have a cold answer ready, and that she felt uncomfortable lacking one. That is how toxic narratives break down, not all at once in a single dramatic confrontation, but the way my grandfather's dovetail stair trades were built, one careful, deliberate joint at a time. In the next generation, in a 9-year-old girl who now understands precisely what an honest day's labor is worth. It required an empty velvet box to teach me the fundamental lesson my family tried to keep from me. No one else possesses the authority to set your value. Not your mother, not your relatives, not a room full of critical observers. No one. Unless you are the one who hands them the pen. That is my story. An empty wrapped gift, a tarnished union emblem, and a home that will never carry a price tag. If someone in your life has ever attempted to measure your character in financial metrics or social standing, and some quiet, stubborn part of you refused to let them dictate your worth, consider this your reminder today: hold your ground. Reach out to the person who sees you clearly for who you are. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you in the next episode of Their Secret Stories.